Order, order. The Prime Minister.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that the sitting be now adjourned. I call Mr Steve Webb.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs Humble, and good morning to you. It's a pleasure to serve, I think, for the first time under your chairmanship this morning. The issue of the deficit position of NHS trusts is one that has exercised me for a long time, but in which I have a particular local interest, which will become abundantly clear very quickly. My focus in this debate, in fact, had not intended to be principally on where the deficits came from, but what we do with them now we've got them. In a sense, there are a variety of accounts of where the deficits have come from. The Health Select Committee identified issues about central government policy, about local financial management, a whole range of factors that have led to the deficits. But we are where we are, and my key concern is that trusts should know where we're going. Now, normally I'm rather pleased when a public sector body in my constituency is top of a league table. But on this occasion, I regret that my local NHS Trust, North Bristol NHS Trust, is top of a league table that I would rather we didn't feature in at all. As at the 31st of March 2005, and this is using figures quoted by the Audit Commission in their June 2006 report, the league table of NHS trusts with the largest cumulative deficits features North Bristol NHS Trust, my local trust, right at the top of that league table. I don't know whether the Minister will be able to give us the figures as at March 2006. These were the latest cumulative deficit figures I was able to obtain based on audited NHS accounts. But I strongly suspect that North Bristol's premier position in this league table won't have radically altered since the end of March 2005. What's interesting about this league table is that in the top 10, 3 of the top 10 are actually local to my constituency, and I think it's an interesting point that when we think about NHS finances, in many ways it's sensible to think about what's known in the jargon as the local health economy rather than simply an individual NHS trust. So, as well as top spot for the North Bristol Trust, the Royal United Hospital at Bath comes in at number 4, and the trust in the centre of Bristol, United Bristol Healthcare, comes in at number 10. And I want to start off by focusing on the situation with the North Bristol Trust, with its deficits, just briefly to describe factually where they came from and to raise some questions with the Minister about where that particular trust is going, and that's really why I sought this debate, Mrs Humble. But also then to reflect slightly more widely on the fact that this isn't unique to my local trust and that there are wider issues which I'm sure the respective front benches will want to comment on which I'd like to make some observations of my own. By way of background then, North Bristol NHS Trust managed to accumulate a deficit of £52 million by 2003-04, and I fully accept that local financial control had failed. I don't think there's any question about that. I remember one member of the board saying to me that the finance director used to present the financial reports and nobody really understood them, but he was a very convincing sort of chap, and if he said things were all right, then things were probably all right. And clearly in an era of a £70 or £80 billion National Health Service, we can't begin to operate on that basis, and I fully accept that that was particularly an issue of local control. And indeed the then chairman and then chief executive are no longer in post. In fact, the finance director as well, I believe, none of them are any longer in post. So the comments I make about that period don't relate at all to the present management of the trust. But accountants were called in to investigate how the situation had got so out of hand, and I do think that early warning signs might have been registered much sooner before this huge £52 million deficit had been accumulated. Now, that £52 million wasn't written off. It was added to what's known in the jargon as the public dividend capital of the trust, and I shall come back to that point in a moment. But clearly, once that sort of level of deficit had been run up, it wasn't going to be removed overnight. So a recovery plan was put in place. But in each of the succeeding years, deficits, falling deficits, but deficits carried on. And over the succeeding years up to 2005-06, a further £48 million was added to the deficit. A total of £48 million was spent more than came in through the income of the trust. And clearly, again, that money had to be loaned or provided to the trust from elsewhere in the NHS. Now, add the 52 and the 48 and you get an uncomfortably round 100 million figure. And that's a figure that the department itself has used in a letter to North Bristol Trust turning down their application for foundation status. The department said that in part this was because of the £100 million debt, and indeed the local Strategic Health Authority, the South West Regional, I think it's called this year, the South West Strategic Health Authority, opposed North Bristol Trust's bid for foundation status, partly because, I think principally because, of uncertainty about this £100 million debt. Now, interestingly, when you talk to the Trust, they have a rather different perspective on this. Although the letter from the Department of Health talked about a £100 million debt, the Trust deny that they have a deficit at all. And there's a certain amount of semantics going on here, and the arcane niceties of NHS finances are going on here. But it's worth understanding why the Department of Health can think there's a £100 million deficit or debt, and the Trust think that there isn't one at all. And the story here is in two parts. The £52 million deficit that was run up in the years to 2003-04, as I say, was added to the public dividend capital of the Trust. And what I hadn't realised until I spoke to the Trust is that this wasn't the only public dividend capital of the Trust. They have several £100 million of public dividend capital. And trying to get to the bottom of this, it appears that this is a kind of fairly low-interest mortgage, a sort of long-term loan, a little bit akin to Treasury debt or gilts or bonds, that kind of thing, except that, and this is the crunch, nobody knows if it will have to be repaid or not. That £52 million. And my understanding of the Trust position is that they are happy and able to continue servicing that public dividend capital, paying to the Treasury, I assume, the interest, or whatever label it goes under. It might be called interest or repayments, whatever it is. That's sustainable. Paying the debt on that £52 million of public dividend capital is sustainable. What isn't sustainable is paying back that £52 million plus the 48. Paying back £100 million on which is about getting on for a third of the entire annual income of the Trust, is, in my view, not sustainable. So one thing that would be exceptionally helpful if the Minister could say anything about is the status of that £52 million. I believe that the Government are thinking about it. I believe that some sort of announcement may be imminent, and it would be particularly welcome if the Minister wanted to make that announcement to the House in the first instance, rather than us reading it in the columns of the local newspapers. But then there's the £52 million of deficit. Then there's the £48 million. And that, as I say, is the further deficit that was run up during the recovery period. And nobody blames the hospital for the fact that they couldn't turn huge deficit round overnight. They did what happens everywhere where trusts are in deficit. They did more day case surgery, got people out quicker, cut down on the use of agency nurses. And many of these things are not at all exceptionable. Interestingly, the Trust was failing, back in those days, lamentably, to cut its agency spend. It had a huge buying power in the regional health economy as a buyer-in of agency nursing services and was paying over the odds for them. And through poor management of resources, was using too much agency and temporary staff at a very high premium. So, in a sense, the financial crisis that they were clearly in prompted a more efficient way of working, and that's entirely proper. And as much as anybody else in this chamber, Mrs Humble, I would want to see NHS resources well spent, and where the changes are about greater efficiency, then I applaud them and support them. But what's not clear now, again, is the status of that £48 million bailout over the 3 years to 2005-06. My understanding, incidentally, and for the record, is that the current financial year that we are in, North Bristol Trust will not receive any bailout of any description, but in fact their current anticipation is that their income will exceed their expenditure without any bailout from the rest of the NHS. So in a sense, it is to salute the work that has gone on, particularly by the hard-working staff, and indeed, not that I'm always their greatest fan, but by the management of the Trust for getting the Trust into an ongoing financial balance. But somebody had to mention resource accounting and budgeting in this debate, and I suppose it ought to be me, really. Because part of the problem of all of this is that once you're in a downward spiral, it's very difficult to get out of one. I just want to quote a sentence from the Audit Commission's report, jointly with the National Audit Office, in June 2007, where they say this: "Experience indicates that once an NHS body incurs a significant deficit, it becomes increasingly difficult to return to financial balance, particularly where management's attention is focused on resultant short-term pressures rather than longer-term financial balance." And really that is part of the problem, that a trust spends more than it has coming in by way of income, and so that deficit is knocked off their income for the following year. So if they effectively have a structural deficit in year 1, they have a double structural deficit in year 2, and unless they can get things under control, that then gets added to the deducted from the income in year 3, and so the downward spiral continues. And I think the government recognises, certainly the Audit Commission recognises, that whilst resource accounting and budgeting has some merit at a national accounts level, it's not working for the NHS. And indeed, I think that's the view of the Chief Executive of the NHS, who was quoted in The Guardian in December of last year as saying that the NHS accounting system was, and I quote, unsustainable and inconsistent. He said, and again I quote, "The way in which resource accounting and budgeting is applied to NHS trusts, although providing a strong disincentive to overspend, will become increasingly unsustainable as we move forward with the programme of reform." So in a sense, even the Chief Executive of the NHS, the Audit Commission, balanced, sane voices are saying something's got to change, something's got to give. So then the question is, well, what do we do about where we are, this £100 million? And I've already had, on an online petition on my own website, hundreds of local people petitioning for some of this debt to be written off. And what's interesting is that, in a sense, you would imagine it's a no-brainer. You know, a local MP says to local people, do you want your local hospital trust debts written off? And you would think that people would just say, yes, please, you know, it's free money. But in fact, some of my constituents didn't respond in that way. Such was the problem in the management, the financial management at the trust, that some of them contacted me and said, well, we only want some of this debt written off if the trust can prove it's got its financial house in order. And in fact, that is also my view, that we can't simply write trusts that have got into a complete mess a blank cheque, that there does need to be, you know, one of the conditions for any financial assistance needs to be a requirement that it's not just pouring good money after bad, and that financial discipline has been restored. Now, I believe that to be the case at North Bristol Trust. I believe that the Trust has got its financial house in order, subject to one caveat that I will come on to. And therefore, I think that condition is met. But I would want to stress we're not simply about rewarding failure in any sense. And obviously that brings us on to a slightly wider question that would apply to all of these deficit trusts, which is the paradox. If a trust gets into a mess, do you let it sink? Or do you bail it out? And if you bail out trusts that are in a mess, do you reward failure? And if you spend the money that you bail out failing and struggling trusts by taking it from trusts that are doing well and have made a surplus and have managed well, do you penalise success and disincentivise success? And I recognise, and I think I would be the first to recognise, Mrs Humble, the trade-off that is at work here. There isn't a free lunch in this. There are issues about incentives. But I think my view would be that we don't need to take an extreme position on this. In other words, at one extreme you could say, the trust's in a mess, it needs bailing out, give us some cash. At the other end you could say, as ministers are fond of saying, trusts need to learn to live within their means, no bailouts, no help, period. And I feel that somewhere between those two extreme positions lies common sense and sanity. It has to. And the reason that it has to is basically some of these trusts will never recover from the debts that they're in. And I want to quote here, Mrs Humble, if I may, from the Health Select Committee's report, first report of session 2006-7, where they say this: whilst the NHS may be in overall surplus by the end of March 2007, not all trusts will be in surplus by then, and this is the key point, and it is unlikely that trusts with the biggest deficits will be able to repay their accumulated deficits in 5 years. And that's obviously a significant period because that's the statutory requirement to achieve financial balance. It is important that as a first step they achieve in-year balance, which is what North Bristol Trust have done, and then it says this: where there is no realistic chance of recovering the deficit over the 3 to 5 year period without severely affecting services, consideration should be given to allowing a longer period to pay off historic deficits. So the all-party select committee with a Labour majority is saying that there is a set of trusts, a subset of trusts, perhaps a small number, where things have just gone too far to apply the normal rules. And I believe that North Bristol Trust, par excellence, falls into that category. Now, sticking with the North Bristol example, why is all this particularly important? Well, as the Minister will know, North Bristol Trust applied for foundation trust status, and this is what the government wants every trust to have by the end of next year. And they were turned down because of the uncertainty about this debt. Now, I find this quite puzzling because, as I understand it, the whole 100 million is uncertain. The status of the 52 public dividend capital is uncertain. We don't know whether it's time-limited or indefinite, infinite, as it were. The 48 is uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen to that. But actually, a lot of this was accumulated 4 years ago. So why don't we know? And that's one of my key questions for the Minister, because in that league table that I read out, that the Audit Commission and the NAO produced, there is a column for cumulative deficit as at March 2005. There is a column for number of years of cumulative deficit, and North Bristol Trust at that point had 4 years. And then there is a final column, anticipated year of recovery. And for 5 of the 10 trusts in that list, it doesn't give a date. It says, to be agreed. And a year later, well, nearly a year on from the June NAO report, it's still to be agreed. So the Trust had to make an application for Foundation Trust status. So they didn't have to make a Foundation Trust application, but in fact they're being encouraged to make a Foundation Trust application, not knowing whether they've got to pay off a £100 million deficit or not, or how much of it, or over what time. And if you imagine, Mrs Humble, if you imagine applying for a mortgage, and on your form you explain that you may or may not have to pay back a third of your income, the mortgage company might well just be a little bit reluctant to take you on. I think they want a bit more clarity than that. And that's the problem. How has the government allowed North Bristol Trust to be left in this limbo for so long without an answer to the question that I'm putting to the Minister this morning, and I hope he will answer this morning, which is to say how much of this will have to be repaid, on what terms and in what form. Now, there's a second reason why this is crucially important to North Bristol Trust. As the Minister will know, as indeed I think he announced last Monday, Tuesday, North Bristol Trust is about to embark on a £350 million-ish private finance initiative project. And the investment is welcome. The way it's funded isn't, and the place it's going isn't, but I mean, apart from that, it's fine. But £350 million is going to incur, for decades to come, a substantial liability. Creditors who will be pretty much at the front of the queue, if not at the front of the queue. Now, how is that going to work? Would I, as a private finance company, be willing to build a hospital for North Bristol Trust and anticipate a future stream of revenue from North Bristol Trust if I don't know if they've got a £100 million hole in their balance sheet? Now, I hope the Minister will say that will all be resolved very soon. But until it is resolved, that process can't move forward. So, again, I mean, I'd like to see the new hospital somewhere else, but just in terms of the money being spent on modernising our local NHS, we are in limbo because that PFI process can't go any further without certainty about the debt. And there is a linked issue because we all know that servicing these PFI debts can, in some cases, be a severe burden on a trust. And my honourable friend for North Norfolk, who speaks for our party on these matters from the front bench, has local constituency experience of the impact of PFI projects on local NHS Trust finances, and it can be seriously adverse. And again, how can the Trust budget for the coming years when it will have all of the uncertainties that every other trust has to deal with, plus a PFI commitment that won't go away, and a debt to service for decades to come, and the uncertainty about debt servicing costs? And, of course, here we are, just a few weeks from the start of a new financial year. I have no doubt that North Bristol Trust has already planned its finances for 2007-2008. But have they done so knowing or not knowing what the government is about to decide about the repayment of any or all of this £100 million? My impression from the Trust is that they don't know. They may have been given nods and winks. There may be conversations I've not been privy to. But certainly in the public domain, we don't know. So are they going to suddenly find out that in 2007-8, they will have to pay, say they only had to pay back a tenth of the deficit next year? Doesn't sound much, does it? That's £10 million. Well, that would make, can you imagine, with 2 weeks before the start of the financial year, discovering you've got to find £10 million out of your plan? It would be crazy. It would be absolutely typical of the way the finances of the NHS are managed. Indeed, it's something of a privilege if you find out about a financial change in the NHS before the year starts. It's normal to find out halfway through. But I hope the Minister can give us assurances that whatever decision he comes to about the repayment of any or all of this money, that the Trust will be given plenty of forewarning and not be expected to make substantial repayments early in a way that would affect frontline patient care. And in a sense, that brings us on really to a very important facet of all of this, Mrs. Humble, because it isn't ultimately an accounting issue. It isn't ultimately a technical issue. It's about the impact that these deficits have on the effective functioning of the National Health Service. And I want then to look at why these deficits matter so much. And again, drawing on the excellent report of the Audit Commission and National Audit Office, because they highlight 4 important areas, 4 reasons, as it were, why these deficits matter. And the first thing that they highlight is the impact of cost-cutting on service delivery. Now, the Minister will say, well, actually, we're treating more people and we're hitting our targets and waiting times are all coming down and so on. And there's a lot of truth in that. But what tends to happen is that the cost-cutting affects anything where there isn't a target attached to it. Anything that doesn't hit a performance indicator, anything that's not within the things that are monitored for targets, that's what gets cut. And there are things that trusts can do. For example, the introduction of minimum waiting times, treating people later than is necessary, happens because trusts are trying to make ends meet, and that's an impact on frontline patient care. I fully accept it doesn't take us back to the extraordinary waiting times that we had 10 years ago, but clearly where trusts are trying to make ends meet and are making what are sometimes short-term decisions that may not be the optimal long-term decisions. And I think this is one of the worries that I think the Audit Commission and NAO rightly highlight, which is that some trusts are making ends meet in the short term by doing entirely short-termist things which actually have a damaging long-term impact. Sometimes, for example, in the past, I think the rules have changed now, capital investment would be deferred, switched into just trying to make the revenue budget add up to the long-term detriment of the trust. And again, I would urge the Minister that in any schedule of repayments that he announces for North Bristol Trust, that the long-term stability of the trust be preserved, that they be able to make decisions based on long-termism, not just on desperately scrabbling around to try and make the budget add up by the end of Wednesday fortnight. Now, obviously the fundamental concern is on service delivery, the impact of cost-cutting on service delivery. But the second impact is on cash shortages, and this is something that North Bristol Trust has suffered from. Even towards the end of last year, which was a year when, in a sense, North Bristol Trust were on the brink of financial balance, towards the end of last year, they had to borrow money to pay the bills. Now, that just seems a ridiculous situation to be in. And these cash shortages can have very serious effects. The NAO provide a case study of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital NHS Trust, who in 2005-06 were struggling financially. And some of the things that they considered withholding were tax and national insurance payments for their staff, payments to their PFI partners, and general payments to creditors. And each of those would have had a worrying consequence. In the end, they were bailed out by a sort of emergency cash brokerage. But if you imagine non-payment of the PFI partners, that would clearly have increased the cost to everybody in the NHS of future PFI projects. If people who do PFI in the health service realise that cash-strapped trusts might default on a payment, delay a payment, that would just make it more expensive to do things through PFI. So that has a cost implication. What if trusts do, as they are doing, delay paying their bills to private suppliers and small businesses? The public sector is supposed to set standards in prompt payment, but NHS trusts are some of the worst bodies paying their bills. And that, of course, leads to a premium. If I want to do business with an NHS trust, I will build into my price the cost of the fact that they delay payment. So this cash crisis has a consequence. And, of course, why should the general taxpayer, Revenue and Customs, wait for the national insurance payments for NHS employees from trusts just because they're broke? So these short-term cash shortages have real impacts, and too many trusts are facing them. The third thing that the NAO and Audit Commission report highlights is the way that management resources are diverted. If you imagine that you are a trust in cumulative deficit of £100 million, the chances are that it's the finance director, not the clinical director, who gets most attention. And that is a real worry. Now, that's not saying that there isn't first-rate clinical care at North Bristol Trust. In many cases, there is. But it's human nature that if you are a manager wrestling with a debt of this sort that you don't know when you have to repay, that so much of your energy is devoted to trying to save money, make short-term economies, and inevitably that's going to be at the expense of a focus on patient care. And then the last reason that the NAO highlight is the one that I mentioned, is the impact on future foundation status. In other words, trusts with these accumulated deficits, how are they ever going to become foundation trusts? Because clearly there is a different regime. Foundation trusts can fail. The failure mechanism isn't well worked out yet, I don't think. But I wonder if the Minister could clarify whether his timetable for making all NHS trusts foundation trusts is still on track, whether he still expects that to happen by the end of 2008. Because I can't see how North Bristol Trust, with an accumulated deficit of 100 million, is going to become a foundation trust unless we have write-off of some of it, clarity of the repayment schedule, and an affordable repayment schedule, even coupled with a PFI liability that they're about to start. So are we really going to be on for 2008, and how is that compatible with wider government policy? So, Mrs Humble, it's a local and specific issue, but it's also a more general issue that these deficits are having. Now, I mentioned that North Bristol Trust doesn't think that it actually has any debts at all, in one sense, because they don't appear as formal debts in the normal way on the balance sheet. I mentioned the private dividend capital, but I just want some clarification, if I may, on the other slice, the 48 million. Because the way that North Bristol Trust tell the story is that in any given year they were, I don't think they used the verb bailed out, but I mean that's obviously what it was, bailed out. But they say that was a freestanding transaction and there is no clear reciprocal obligation arriving from that transaction. There was never, when that money was handed over, a deadline for paying it back. And I think, Mrs Humble, this increases the uncertainty that trusts face, because it's not clear to me, if North Bristol Trust, as well as simply breaking even, now start to make surpluses, and you have a hypothetical neighbouring trust which has no historic deficit that also starts to make surpluses, will there now effectively, and I hope the Minister can respond on this specific point, now be a kind of, I don't want to be sort of hysterical about this, will there really now be a North Bristol tax to match the North Bristol subsidy? In other words, two identical trusts next door to each other, one with an accumulated deficit, one with none, who both make a small surplus. Will they be equally required to put back into the national pot to deal with deficit trusts? Or will North Bristol Trust have, as it were, more of a handicap, more of a break because of its previous help it received in the past? In other words, will there be, will a trust have more of a penalty on financial recovery if it has historic deficits? And how does that work with foundation status? Because presumably once you're a foundation trust, your surpluses are yours to dispose of as you see fit. Now, it may be that what the Minister will say is, well, we'll resolve all of that before they become foundation trusts. But presumably, if the timescale is the end of 2008, they're not going to be able to pay the money back. I mean, possibly ever, but certainly not by the end of 2008. So there must be some debt carried forward or deficit carried forward into their existence as a foundation trust. So how will that work? Will that be some sort of first claim on their surpluses if they make them? I think it would be very helpful if the Minister could clarify that for us. So, drawing these threads together, Mrs Humble, one of the things that I think has bedevilled the National Health Service in recent years, and there have been improvements, I've supported the extra investment that has been made, and I think that that's entirely welcome, but has been financial uncertainty, has been in-year changes. I mean, I think some of the primary care trusts have been top-sliced 3 times within a year. And now we've got acute trusts that are expected to plan for a new hospital and a new generation who still don't really know where they stand. Now, it's not, as I say, just North Bristol Trust. And the Guardian piece I referred to earlier, the Chief Executive of the NHS, as the Guardian puts it, did not dispute, I'm not quite sure what that means, but did not dispute reports that at least a dozen trusts were in an irrecoverable financial predicament. Now, I'm aware of the statutory duty to break even, and the letter that I referred to from the Department of Health to North Bristol Trust said that North Bristol Trust was in breach of its statutory duty to break even because it had failed to recover within 5 years. Now, I wouldn't want to be reported as saying that the Chief Executive of North Bristol Trust should be clapped in irons and dragged away to Hallfield Prison. But what does it mean to breach a statutory duty? I mean, if it's statutory, if a law has been broken, what happens? I'm not quite clear that this statutory duty has any force, because this letter said, well, you're in breach of your statutory duty. And life appears to be going on pretty much as before. So I wonder if the Minister could just clarify what force that has. Because returning to the league table I referred to, 4 of the 10 trusts had at that point 4 years of material cumulative deficit. So I think several of them were on course to breach their statutory duty. Mrs Humble, at one level we could talk about the deficits in NHS trusts in any given year, and we could have had a whole session on that. But my particular focus has been on accumulated deficits, because my perception is that they're like a millstone around the neck of those trusts, and North Bristol Trust being the exemplar of this, a millstone around the neck of the hard-working people. And I'm sure the Minister in his remarks will quite properly pay credit to the people who work at North Bristol Trust, who do an outstanding job. Most of the inevitably members of Parliament are contacted when things go wrong, but I do receive a good flow of people who just want to let me know what a good experience they've had, and I don't think anything that I've said this morning is designed to say anything other than that. But those people and the patients of the North Bristol Trust fundamentally need to know where they stand. And so, just drawing these threads together, my plea for my constituents and my trust, but also for trusts across the land, is certainty, first of all. They need to know where they stand, and they need plenty of warning if they're going to have to repay some of this money or all of this money. My second plea is to say that there are some trusts which are in the words of everybody, an unrecoverable position as regards their historic deficits. The current position may well be recovered, but the historic position is a millstone, and action does need taking on that. I recognise that needs to be conditional. And it needs to be conditional on getting their financial house in order, which I think North Bristol Trust have now done. But there needs to be certainty, and I believe the uncertainty has gone on for far too long. I believe that the government may be about to make a decision on this, and I would welcome that. I would simply urge that in recognition of the achievements that have been made, the progress that has been made, this not be left as a millstone. I would particularly value some assurances that the public dividend capital simply be allowed to roll on indefinitely, because clearly the most sustainable way of dealing with it is to allow the trust to go on servicing that debt, but without having to repay the capital. And I'd be very grateful for the Minister's clarifications as to what future liabilities have been incurred by North Bristol, implicit or explicit, in respect of the help they've had since the lump sum bailout. In other words, when they were helped over the last 3 years, is there now a future expectation that that money will be paid back, or simply that as it becomes a surplus trust, some or all of that money will go into the pot for other parts of the NHS that are no longer in surplus? So, Mrs Humble, it's a privilege to have the opportunity to raise this important issue in this chamber, and I look forward to hearing the contributions of other honourable members.
Thank you, Mrs Humble, and I would like to add my congratulations to the Honourable Gentleman. It's good to have him back on health matters, and like the Honourable Gentleman for Edisbury, I think we have a rare treat this morning of finest brains in the Lib Dems giving us their thoughts on Lib Dems and NHS finances. A very enticing prospect that is, I'm sure. I know that he's spent much of his time describing the details at North Bristol NHS Trust, and I will deal specifically with some of the questions that he's raised with regard to North Bristol. But I hope he will permit me, given the ambit of the debate he's called, that I can go more broadly and discuss some more general points of relating to the treatment of debt within the NHS. I should just say I'm pleased that my honourable friend, the member for Bristol North West, has joined us too, who I know takes a very close interest in the future of that particular trust and its plans going forward. We are 25 days away now from the financial year, the end of the financial year, and I would readily accept it's not been an easy financial year for parts of the NHS, and all three honourable gentlemen, Mrs Humble, have tempted me to preempt some of the decisions that as a government we would take when reviewing that financial year, and they'll have to forgive me if I don't accept their invitation to do that, but in taking the question, I will seek to give some more flavour of our thinking on these matters and hopefully share some of our thoughts as to where this leads us going forward. As the Honourable Gentleman anticipated, I think it is right that we set out some context into this debate around the treatment of debt within the NHS. The government has injected an unprecedented level of funding into the NHS, and in doing so has improved the quality of patient care and access to health services beyond all recognition. The level of NHS funding has doubled in the years between this government first taking office and the current financial year, and will effectively treble by the end of 2007-08, the financial year that's just about to begin. In fact, under our stewardship, the NHS has enjoyed the benefit of average annual real terms growth of 6.3%, more than double the level of historic annual growth before 1997. It should be said that those figures should be put in context, in that the demands on the health service do rise every year, but nevertheless that figure speaks for itself. And just to take one of the comments that the Honourable Gentleman for Edisbury said, in saying that at the end of the 2005-2006 financial year, that represented the biggest deficit in the history of the NHS, I think the words he used. The audited year-end deficit of net deficit of 547 million needs to be set against the final accounts for 1996-97, where the deficit was 459 million. Yeah, granted, lower than last year's deficit, but the 547 million represented 0.7% of total NHS revenue spend. The 1996-97 deficit represented 1.5% of NHS total revenue spend, and I'm pretty confident in saying that was a far larger percentage than had ever been seen in the NHS before, and I think he should just reflect on that point before handing out the lessons. Mr Humble, this is a fact that every primary care trust received an above-inflation increase in 2006-07 and will do so again next year. That is an average of 9.4% across the NHS. It is also a fact that by far the majority of NHS organisations have continued to deliver the high-quality improvements to patient care that we have asked for, while remaining in financial balance or better. Moreover, by allocating the vast majority of central NHS programme funds to strategic health authorities much earlier in this year, and thereby devolving significantly more control over funding to local decision-making, we believe that the NHS has much greater flexibility at a local level to balance local needs and the delivery of national targets. If I can, I just want to say a word at the beginning of this debate about the announcement last week on the North Bristol PFI scheme. I know for the Honourable Gentleman it's been the matter of some controversy. I know for my Honourable friend it's a very welcome announcement. I think I picked up when I heard him, but a kind of grudging pleasure that the decision was finally taken and that the Trust can move forward. And I think on that and on finances, I would accept the point he was making to me that clarity is the important thing for this particular hospital trust at this moment in time, that it needs to know its future, where it is heading, and how it can go from a cycle of some difficult decisions into a cycle of improvement and clarity about the future. And I accept that general point, and I hope that that we can begin to give more and more of that certainty as the weeks progress. The scheme that was put forward, I believe, was a very exciting and also financially viable scheme, a £347 million PFI for the North Bristol NHS Trust, which I'm led to believe will transform acute services in the area. And I pay tribute to my honourable friend for the persistent way in which he pressed the case for the Trust and the need for an announcement, and I, in the end, was happy to meet him and make that announcement for the benefit of the Trust. I hope that he will accept that there is, in terms of the management of finance going forward over long term, it makes more sense, while he may have some disagreement about the location of the scheme, that it does make sense for the Trust to be able to benefit from modern facilities in which to provide healthcare, and also that those facilities shouldn't be spread over multiple sites, that there will be benefits there for the Trust in terms of managing finance and running costs over the long term. And of course there will be all the benefits that come from a larger integrated clinical team sharing experience and knowledge. So that is part of the background, I think, to the debate he's called today. But I will come on to address some of the questions he put to me around the financial certainty of the Trust, because that's the other side of the equation. We've now more clarity on the estates question. But let me just say a word overall. We don't underestimate the very real financial and in some cases operational challenges faced by some organisations in 2006-07. The Honourable Gentleman referred to some of them. We've always been clear that the priority for this year would be to return the NHS to financial balance overall. For this reason, as the current year got underway, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, laid out 3 clear financial objectives to be delivered by the NHS without compromising progress against public service agreement targets. Those were to deliver net financial balance across the NHS as a whole by 31st of March 2007. Secondly, to see an improvement in the financial performance of all organisations that reported a deficit in 2005-06. Thirdly, to achieve recurrent monthly run rate balance across as many NHS organisations as possible by the end of this financial year. The Honourable Gentleman asked us what we will take responsibility for. We will take responsibility for the delivery of those objectives alongside the commitment that that would not lead to the breach of key public service agreement targets. And I'm confident that we can and we will be held to those promises, and the NHS is well placed to deliver on that. As we reported in our 3rd quarterly report on NHS finances, the NHS has made considerable progress in delivering against each of our key financial objectives and remains on course to end the year in net financial balance. Taking account of the 450 million savings that strategic health authorities have identified by their continued good management of central NHS programme funds, the NHS overall recorded a forecast year-end surplus of some 13 million at the end of the 3rd quarter of the year. This is a remarkable achievement, Mrs Humble, and bears witness to the hard work of NHS staff across the country in seeking to deliver savings, increase the efficiency of working practices and reduce deficits. And I thank the Honourable Gentleman for saying that he didn't demur from that principle, that people should be constantly challenged to provide more efficient and more productive ways of working. The magnitude of the improvement is perhaps best understood by looking at the movement in the net deficit over the last couple of years. At the end of 2004-05, the net deficit stood at 221 million. This increased to 547 million by the time of the 05-06 final accounts. If this trend had continued on a simple straight line basis, we might have expected a net deficit of around 750 million by the end of the current year. Instead, the forecast surplus of 13 million at Q3, coupled with our expectation to at least achieve financial balance by the end of the year, illustrates very clearly what a significant improvement there has been, and we believe creates a platform of stability for the NHS moving on from this year. Just to consider for a moment those organisations that were in deficit at the end of the last financial year, then in terms of their current in-year financial position, that is when the impact of deductions for prior overspending is ignored. There has been a very significant improvement in those organisations, Mrs Humble. Our analysis shows that 82% of trusts and 69% of PCTs are forecasting an improved in-year position compared to 2005-06. Deficits continue to be concentrated in a small minority of organisations, with 50% of the gross deficit attributable to just 5% of organisations. By far the majority of organisations are in balance or better and continue to deliver service and quality improvements. In terms of achieving run rate balance, I'm pleased to be able to say that a healthy majority of all NHS organisations reported a positive monthly run rate balance at Q3. In fact, our analysis indicates that only a small number, and to be precise, 17 organisations are not likely to achieve this objective by the end of March. I think it's right to pay tribute to the trust that serves the constituents of the honourable gentleman represented here today, because they have, I believe, made a very clear and obvious improvement since the difficulties a few years ago, and are now in run rate balance, hence their wish to push on and achieve foundation trust status. I think there has been a very clear improvement, and I'm sure they would join me in welcoming that. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, and I agree with him on that. But, does he understand, can he explain at all why he thinks that in the east of England, for example, the situation appears to be moving in the other direction, that the total deficit in the SHA area has increased at the end of Q3 compared to Q2. So all of the disciplines that he's talking about appear not to be working in the east of England.
Well, I was going to come on to the point that he raised about causes of deficits, and perhaps pick up that point in this section, because I think he himself said in his comments that the origins are not simple. You cannot pinpoint one factor, and they are indeed complex. But I think he used a phrase saying it's not good enough just to say that the quality of management is not good enough in that geographical region, and that too is of course true. But what I think I need to say to the honourable gentleman is that it is true to say that there has been a pattern of overspending in certain parts of the country that has been allowed to continue rather than be tackled. And I think that is part of what has happened this year, in that nettle has been grasped. The NHS financial system of old did not provide ready transparency about that problem. If you looked at the year-end accounts, you wouldn't have automatically seen that there was a clear problem of overspending in that particular region. So it didn't jump out where the problems were. It was all as if by magic everything was cleared. And I think what we're seeing is that the new financial regime is bringing much greater clarity to where the problems lie with respect to overspending. And I think one of the difficult points that perhaps we do need to explain more is that the NHS is not the same in all parts of the country. It is funding a different infrastructure in different parts of the country, and that needs to be reflected when considering the cause of deficits. I feel the need to answer some of the specific points that the honourable gentleman raised in his comments. He asked about the situation of the Trust in relation to their PFI, and how the two could be kind of married up, in that there was still a big issue to address with regard to the treatment of debt, and yet there was a progress on the PFI. What I would want to say to him is that I can confirm that the Trust plans were assessed as being financially sound as part of the overall review that the government has done, and that was looking at the size of the scheme, would it meet future health needs. But it is true to say that when we come to the final business case assessment, and the final process, we would have to consider the financial position of the Trust, and that any consideration of that would of course consider the current financial position of the Trust. He asked me again about what was the force of statutory duty in respect of breaking even. What exactly did it mean? When an organisation breaches a statutory duty to break even, the appointed auditors will issue a public interest report to the Secretary of State notifying her of the breach. The Department will work with the organisation via the SHA to put in place a plan to manage that financial position and ensure that they remain a viable public body, and there are no penalties imposed. So that brings me, I think, to his central question about what happens to the debt. What's the position going forward? It is true to say that North Bristol NHS Trust is one of a small number of organisations that present particular challenges to the department in terms of how we map a course forward, in that their debts are of a significant level. He used the figure 100 million. That is a figure that we recognise and that we accept that the overall figure is in that region. But he preempts the decision that will be taken about how to put that trust on a viable footing going forward. What I can assure him is that the points that he's made today will be borne in mind, and I accept the points he makes around the viability of services going forward, not requiring the Trust to make unacceptable changes to services, also not giving them sufficient time to plan so that the impact of any changes can be properly absorbed in a way that doesn't threaten the viability of services. If he's asking me today what is the final conclusion about what is to be done, then I'm afraid he preempts that discussion and that decision. Does he want? I'll give way.
Could he clarify whether he is even considering the suggestion that the 52 million which was added to the public dividend capital might remain? Is that an option?
Well, what I would say to him, this is a point that I was going to come on to in respect of RAB, and other colleagues have raised that, so I will give an answer, seek to give an answer in the time that remains to me. I think the point I would want to get over to him is that he said it himself, there's not a free lunch. And that is absolutely true. The way in which the financial regime operates now is that the NHS can't just allow a deficit to kind of spring up in one part of the system and then not seek to deal with its consequences. Because if there is overspending in one part of the system, under the RAB regime that we operate under as a department to the Treasury, that overspending has to be accounted for by underspending somewhere else. Otherwise, the department overall would incur a problem. So, as a principle, that is absolutely the way in which the department is now taking matters forward, and debts should lie where they are incurred. Otherwise, that would be unfair to the parts of the country that are not experiencing the kind of problems that the Honourable Gentleman is referring to. But as I'm trying to explain to him, the particular position around a small number of trusts, does give rise to special consideration of their financial position to get them back to a point where they are both viable and then able to provide services in a sustainable way. And at this point in time, there are no final decisions taken within the department on exactly... if you'll forgive me, I'm not going to lay out a clear timetable, but there is active consideration being given to this issue. And as I was saying in relation to the PFI, the intention here is to give clarity to the Trust about its viability going forward. And at the earliest opportunity, we will do that. But he must forgive me. We are 25 days away, as I say, from this current financial year. And if I dare I say it, it would be too early to preempt some of those decisions. Equally on RAB, we accept the analysis of the Audit Commission, and we accept the rationale of their review. Overall, the application of RAB provides a strong disincentive for overspending, but it is becoming clear that it's increasingly unsustainable for NHS Trust. What I cannot commit to at this stage is a timetable for the implementation of the Audit Commission recommendation. This in part is because a resource buffer would have to be created to cover NHS overspending centrally. However, I do commit to saying we accept the principle of what was put to us, and that, again, we will come forward with further detail soon. Mrs Humble, there are other issues I'd like to cover. Perhaps the Honourable Gentleman will forgive me if I say that I will write him to tidy up those issues. But generally, I think it's a good debate at a very important time for the NHS.
Order, order. I call